you have infinite flexibility on where you add them. You could add them here at the bottom instead of the top. You could add them higher if you're scared of the buttons ending in alignment with your nipples. It's up to you. The fringe is quite fiddly, it's true. It will take a while and it uses up more yarn, of course. But for me personally, it's one of the most impactful details and why I really love this design. But it looks great without the fringe as well. Hello, my name is Jeanette. I am the designer behind Jeanette Knits, and welcome to another one of my pattern deep dives. This time it's on the blazer. It's a top-down, seamless kind of cardigan jacket knitting pattern. And in this video, I'll tell you about the inspiration, the yarn and gauge and needles that I used, the construction and all the techniques, as well as some possible customizations and modification options. And the rest of the video will be close-up demos of all the techniques and tricks that you need to know in order to make this blazer. So this design was created in collaboration with Spincycle Yarns using their sport weight base called Nocturne. I love my colorway. It's called Moonshine, but there's plenty of other colorways that would be really stunning. You could also use the dyed in the wool because that's also sport weight, or any other sport weight yarn, or in fact multiple strands of lace held together, as long as you get the gauge. And the gauge is 24 stitches times 44 rows or 22 ridges, as it is all over garter stitch. So whatever gets you that gauge is suitable yarn. Mine is quite drapey because I wanted it to be a sort of a light throw on blazer, but if you wanted a more structured and denser fabric, then you could go for a thicker yarn and a smaller needle to get that gauge, because all the calculations, of course, are based on you having that gauge. You can experiment with the yarn to get the texture that you want. Mostly it is worked flat because it's an open cardigan, apart from the sleeves that are worked in the round. So when you do make your gauge swatch, make sure that you try flat, garter stitch flat and garter stitch in the round. To verify that the garter stitch in the round isn't too much different than your flat garter stitch. Otherwise your sleeves will not be as per pattern. And also, depending on what yarn you use, blocking makes a huge difference because it's a very stretchy stitch lengthwise, or should I say stitch pattern lengthwise, and after blocking there is a high risk that your sleeves and your body will be much longer than when you if you try on as you go. So keep that in mind. The whole pattern is worked with one needle size, whichever gets you the gauge. For me, that was a 3.25 millimeter or US size 3, I think. But again, whichever needle size gets you the gauge for the yarn that you've chosen is the right needle size to use. And you will also need buttons, of course, depending on how many you want to place. You can go with smaller or bigger buttons than the pattern states. You can add the flaps or no flaps, so you might not need these 2 buttons here. It's up to you. It's infinitely flexible. And I forgot the inspiration. Most people, when they see this, they get the Chanel vibes, which is actually the root of the inspiration. I think I needed a kind of a jacket blazer in my wardrobe, and because I'm a knitter, it had to be knitted. I've got a lot of sporty cardigans or round yoke cardigans, but I really wanted a little bit more textured, structured piece as well, and this is the result. Now, I will be honest, it is quite cropped for me. It doesn't cover all of my belly, so to speak, and that wasn't necessarily the initial intention. I wanted it to be a little bit longer, but I unfortunately underestimated the yardage or the yarn amounts that I would need to make that, because I hadn't really worked with loop stitch before, and yeah, it just wasn't sure how this would work out. And I think I was exactly one skein short to make it the perfect length, but I do love how it turned out. It's very comfortable, and so I'm still gonna be wearing it a lot. I'll probably have to get myself a dress that goes underneath so that I don't feel so exposed. But yes, you shouldn't have that problem, because the yardage that's given in the pattern is for this schematic. And if you already know that you need it longer, you'll be sure to get more yarn so you can make it the length that you want. Right, the construction. So it is another top down and seamless cardigan with a fully fashioned or European shoulder. So we start with the back and work down, increasing the shoulder seams to when we get to the full width of the back. And then we continue straight until we need to add some more stitches to shape the armholes. And at that point, once the armhole shaping is done, we put those stitches on hold and we pick up stitches along that shoulder seam and work the fronts separately. We also do some decreases here to shape the armhole and create that curve, as well as some increases here to close the neck, and that's called shoulder shaping. And when we're done with the shoulder increases, or decreases I should say, we just finish the neckline and again work each side separately to where the armhole shaping starts with the increases for armhole shaping. Mind you that the buttonholes are worked simultaneously. So the first buttonhole will be on the side where you choose to add your buttonhole. The pattern is written for the buttonholes to be on, what is this, my right side, and the buttons are attached to the left side. But there is a note on how you could adjust it to swap it around if that was your preference. So your first buttonhole will be quite early on in the making of the garment, and you will have to think about the spacing and do some calculations and how often you need to add a buttonhole depending on how long you want, and how many buttons you want to add, and how big your buttons are. So the technique that we're using for the buttonholes here is a 1-row buttonhole, and it's a horizontal buttonhole as we're working it this way. So there will be some movement with it will change the width or circumference around the bust area. It's also recommended that you do think about adding a buttonhole in your widest part of your bust to make sure that you don't have like a gaping hole here. So a little bit of thinking ahead of time. But of course, continuing with the construction, we work, most of it is in garter stitch, but we do continue here the stockinette sort of edge that carries on from when we work the shoulder seam. So that detail is coherently kept also for the shoulders, as well as the back, sides of the back. And once we have completed both fronts to where the armholes are shaped and there's enough stitches, we then transfer all the held stitches onto needles and join everything to be worked in one piece. As you will see, the stripes get a little thinner here because I'm using a lot more of the yarn for each row. If you're working in a solid color, you won't have that to worry about. We keep adding the buttonholes as we need, and there's also an optional waist shaping. I have added the waist shaping. I have decreased stitch towards my waist because I did want it to be quite tailored. And yeah, so the actual edging doesn't really add much length, so you can stop when you reach your desired length and follow the instructions for the hem, which is adding a little fringe like this. Or you can also omit the fringe and just finish a fringeless ridge at the bottom. It's not stuck in it, so there won't be any curling. You don't have to worry about that. One thing that you do have to keep in mind is because it's constructed to have quite a narrow back width here at the shoulder, because I wanted the shoulder seams to be, you know how knitwear stretches a lot. So if I went with the exact measurement of the shoulders as per my standard measurement, the chances are that for some people the shoulder seam would be slipping down to here, and it wouldn't look like a blazer anymore. So that's the reason why the shoulders are narrower, to exaggerate and make sure that the shoulder seam doesn't slide down. And then to get your bust circumference, we do have to compensate for the stitches that we didn't cast on here to get the shoulder seams lying there. And there is quite a lot more stitches cast on at the underarm. And for a lot of test knitters, that part was scary because all of a sudden the armhole looked huge. The one reason, yes, is a little bit deeper because we have this cutout shape here to really emphasize the set-in sleeve of the blazer, and that could be a little bit scary. And another thing that added to and made the situation worse is the stockinette gauge here at the, I'm not pointing at the right place, at the shoulder seam, is the row gauge of that part is it was longer than the rest of the garter stitch, so that stretched it out even more. So the armholes look crazy big when you've just joined in the round and added the underarm cast on, and if you try on, you think that some private parts might be falling out to the side, but that's not the case. So if you are panicking at that time, I really strongly suggest work a few more rows here to stabilize the cast on area, and then switch to working the sleeves, because as soon as you pick up stitches here around the armhole and you do the sleeve stitch gauge adjustment round and you start shaping the cap, there will be a lot of short rows back and forth with some decreases to get the upper arm circumference necessary, because the armhole is much bigger than the upper arm. So we'll be decreasing as well as working short rows here. And I guarantee that as soon as you've finished the cap shaping and you have returned to work the sleeve in the round, the fit will be much, much, much better. And you can decide then if your armholes are too big. If you then still think your armholes are too big and there's no way you will wear that, then chances are you have gone a size too big for you. So I suggest sizing down. And actually, if you want it to look tailored and fit, perhaps it is worth starting a size down because knitwear is forgiving and it will stretch. Yeah, that would be my recommendation. Plus, we know that there will be some movement given we have these horizontal lying buttonholes. So I have talked about the construction of the body, and now the sleeves are just worked in the round with decreases. I did design there to be quite roomy ease for the sleeves as well as the wrist, because I imagined that I might be wearing a shirt underneath or a blouse of some sort, so I wanted there to be enough room, and I'm very happy with that. However, a few test knitters did find that for the sleeves were too wide for what they're used to or for their liking, and you are welcome to adjust it so that you decrease more rapidly, or decrease a lot of those underarm stitches from the get-go so that your sleeve is more fitting. It's a fairly straightforward modification if you have to do that. I just want you to know that the sleeves are designed to be comfortable and might not be what you're typically used to. Now, the most interesting part, you will see that for the hem in the pattern, it says to bind off a few stitches at the sides and then do the edging. And the same here for the neckline. We don't start the edging here at the corner. We start it a bit later. And that's explained also in one of the demos, is because we don't want the joining of the edging to be at the corner, because that doesn't produce a pretty result. So it will be feeling a little awkward at once, but hopefully the close-up demo explains all the reasoning and how to do that. The fringe is quite fiddly, it's true. It will take a while and it uses up more yarn, of course, but for me personally, it's one of the most impactful details and why I really love this design. But it looks great without the fringe as well. And finally, we add, or we don't add, the flaps. There are no pockets. This is just a decorative detail for the illusion of pockets. And you have infinite flexibility on where you add them. You could add them here at the bottom instead of the top. You could add them higher if you're scared of the buttons ending in alignment with your nipples. It's up to you where you add them. The demos will explain how to figure out. The pattern does explain the thinking behind the flaps in this sample, but of course you can take that and be inspired by it, but then add your own twist to it. And you can make it wider, narrower, taller, shorter. It's up to you. So to summarize the possible modifications or customizations, firstly, it is worked seamlessly from the top down. So you could make it even short sleeve if you wanted to. Keep in mind that the garter stitch will likely stretch quite a lot when you after blocking, especially as more weight is. So your swatch might not tell the entire truth, and you might want to block it part way to make sure you don't have to rip the sleeves out after you realize that it's now blocked until here. Of course, you can make the body as long as you like. You can add waist shaping or keep it straight. You can add the fringe or keep it without the fringe. You can add the flaps wherever you like, or keep the flaps off. You can add buttonholes of varying sizes, buttons of varying sizes and in varying numbers, and spaced out as you desire. So all in all, it's quite a flexible knitting pattern, and I really can't wait to see what you make. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the video that shows you pretty much almost everything of the trickier parts that are involved in making this blazer. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. For this blazer, we'll be using 1 row buttonholes that will be situated horizontally. So when we close the button, there will be some movement, and it's very likely that the button will be sitting here at that left corner when looking from above. And another thing that's important to note is that we'll be working the buttonholes as we work the blazer itself, so we won't be adding any additional button bands at the end, which is where you need to figure out the spacing for your buttons as you work at the blazer. You might need to know how long you want to make it and look at the schematic for your size. What is the neck depth from the top of the shoulder? And for every size, the first buttonhole is placed here at the very top. But then the next time the pattern instructs to make a buttonhole is when you join the fronts and backs in the round, and for each size that's a slightly different distance away. And that was just to simplify the instructions, but it shouldn't be too difficult to adjust where you place the buttonholes. All you need to know is that when you reach the desired spot for your next buttonhole, even if you haven't reached the join row, or even if you don't want to place your button so close to the previous one, for example, you're using bigger buttons and they need to be spaced further apart, you can just stop 8 stitches before the end of the row and work the buttonhole at your desired row. It is advised to put a button on your widest part of the chest, the bust, and for me that happens to be around where we join the front and back to work in one piece, but as everyone's different and it depends on your cup size, as well as other aspects, you might need to place the button in a different spot. So here's how we actually do the 1 row buttonhole. We'll bring the yarn to front and slip 1 stitch purlwise, so we don't want to change the orientation of that stitch. And then we bring the yarn back to back. We slip, that is just to secure the yarn here, so we won't be using it for a while. For the next 3 stitches, we'll be slipping another stitch purlwise and passing the previously slipped stitch over. That's once, that's twice, that's 3 times. So this is how big our buttonhole will be. 3 stitches bound off that way, but the yarn is still attached on the other end. And before we knit all the way back, all the way to the end of the row, we need to cast on stitches that we bound off, because we'll need them to continue the fabric there later on. So we slide this last stitch back onto the left hand or your passive needle for the time being, and we turn the work around to cast on the stitches that we just bound off using a cable cast on. And because this is the wrong side, well, for garter stitch it doesn't matter so much, but generally as we're facing the wrong side, we should be using the purlwise cable cast on, and that is inserting the active or the right hand needle from back to front between the first 2 stitches, making a purl loop and pulling it out quite loosely, because cable cast on can be very what's the opposite of stretchy? Inflexible. So we want the buttonhole to be sort of flexible still. We need to make this stitch quite long and loose, and put it back, well, put it on the passive or left hand needle, and then repeat that step. Insert the right hand needle from back to front between the newly created stitch and the existing stitch, and do a purl, stretch it out a bit and put it on the left hand needle. If I was an English style knitter, I'll try to purl English style. So again, inserting the needle there, wrap the yarn around, pull it through, stretch it out and on. So we have now cast on 3 stitches, the same number that we bound off, but to make the closure here, the join here, more seamless, we will be casting on another stitch, so an extra stitch here. It's a 4th stitch that will immediately, we don't even need to put it on the left hand needle, we can leave it on the right hand needle, as immediately we'll turn back and knit it together with the next stitch to close this more seamlessly. See, it's joined here in a more substantial way, so to speak. And then we can either knit all the way to the end of the row, but it's very, very recommended that as you make your first buttonhole and you have your intended buttons or similar buttons at hand, you try to see if it can fit through without trouble, or if it's not too loose that the blazer wouldn't stay closed. For me, it happens to be perfect because I have already tried this. But if it does, if there are some issues with the fit, then you need the buttonhole to be smaller. Instead of binding off 3 stitches, try binding off 2 stitches, and obviously then when you get to the cast on part, cast on 1 less, which will be 3 instead of 4. If you have bigger buttons, then obviously you might need to stop a few stitches before. We stopped 8 stitches before the end of the row, so you might need to move the whole buttonhole to start a bit earlier, and you bind off more stitches and cast on more stitches respectively until you can fit your button through without problems. When you're ready to start the hem, we'll first bind off some stitches here at the edge, and the reason being is that we're going to add the fringe or fringeless edge here at the hem as well as on the side, and we don't want the vertical and horizontal edges to meet here at the corner. It's not going to create a smooth, pretty look. So what we'll do is we'll work the side edge at the same time as a little bit off the bottom, so that the corner is a nice, smooth, rounded, uniform edge without any joints. And then here it's much easier to join the end of the edge here with the rest of the hem, because we can just use mattress stitch and no one would notice much, as opposed to if we did it here at the corner, it would be much more noticeable, and it would be a bigger challenge to get it uniform and looking nice. So for each size there is a number of stitches specified to bind off. For my size, that is 12. And once you've bound off a certain number of stitches, you would be ready to place a lifeline and through the stitches on the needle, and that is simply putting a contrasting color waste yarn through the stitches like so, and that will mark the row where we'll need to pick up stitches later on to join the live edge stitches before binding off. I personally find it very tricky to insert a lifeline while stitches are on the needle, so as an alternative I offer you to work this row all the way to the end and then insert the lifeline in the stitches in the row just below the stitches on the needle, because I'll show on this side, because you can see it's much easier to insert stitches, insert the tapestry needle in the fabric below than trying to get it through where there is already a hard needle. So it will look something like this after you've completed the full row. And when we get to the other side, we'll turn work and bind off another 12 or 16 or whatever the pattern says for your size stitches, and then we'll work the rest of the hem. To work the loop stitch, start by knitting into it, and we've created a new loop. But before we slip off the existing stitch from the left hand needle, we are going to bring the yarn to front, wrap it around the thumb. First we put it on the floor, so to speak, put our thumb over it, and then bring the yarn back to the back of work over the thumb. So the thumb has now measured how much yarn we need to reserve for the loop, and then we need to knit into the stitch once more. And because I'm a continental knitter, I don't want to lose any of this yarn here, and because I'm holding it on my left hand, there's a chance that I'll pull it. So I'm squeezing it tight between the right needle and my thumb while I knit into it. And then I can slip the existing stitch off the left hand needle and remove my thumb. Now I've created 2 stitches instead of 1, so I have to get rid of one, and by passing the first over the second, I also secure the loop in place. So here's how that will look again. Knit into it without slipping, bring the yarn to front, trap it with your thumb, wrap the yarn around the thumb, and knit into it again. Pass the first one over, and there we have a loop. Here's how you'd work it if you're a thrower, English style knitter. You would knit into it, but not slip the stitch. Bring the yarn to front, and this time you'd probably use your other thumb to trap. Bring it back to back. You can now have your index finger help hold it in place. Knit into it again. Remove the thumb and slip the first one over. I strongly recommend you practice this on a swatch if this is the first time doing it, for a few hundred times. 100 times you should do it until you get into the groove and you can see that all your loops are consistent length, because it will depend on whether you wrap it around this part or this part. The circumference of the thumb is not consistent throughout, so make sure you get into the groove, and if you start having loops that are shorter or longer, that will add to the messy look. And then once you've done the whole row or round, soon enough we'll turn it around and we'll hide all these little bumps here by having them appear on the inside only. In order to finish this border, this edge, we'll have to bind it off together as with a picked up stitch from where we placed the lifeline here. So we can either pick it up a stitch as we go by picking it up here, placing it on this needle, and then knitting it together with one of the live stitches. But what's much quicker and easier is if we pick up all the stitches on a separate set of spare needle. So I just kind of find where the contrast yarn is coming out, and I pick up the top of that stitch like so. Another one, another one. And I can go all the way down the hem, or I can pick up a few at a time, bind them off, and then continue picking up again. So I'll pick up a few more before showing you the bind off. That's just 3 needle bind off. So we will hold 2 needles in one hand and knit stitches together before binding them off. Right, so I got all the stitches. Doing it in sections has another benefit. You can you know how many stitches to pick up, because you need the same number of stitches on both needles, so on both places. There we go. And if you are using a smaller needle to pick up the stitches, make sure that you are using the correct size needle to do the bind off. So we knit 2 stitches together, 1 of each needle, and then do the same again, and we're ready to do the first bind off by passing the first over the second, and again knit through the 2 stitches, pass over. If you are an English style knitter, looks like something like that. Making sure you insert the needle knitwise through the first stitches on both needles. Knit and pass it over. And it would look like that on the inside, so make sure you're facing the right side when you do it, and then it will fold down. And of course, once we've completed the bind off, we can remove the contrast yarn, the waste yarn, and we'll have our fringe detail done. Now we're ready to add the finish to the neckline, and we will add an edge like this with a welt and some fringe. The fringe is optional, but for both options, for either with or without fringe, we'll have to start by picking up stitches. For the cuffs and hem, we already had stitches on the needle, so we could just continue working those, and we placed a lifeline to indicate where we'll then pick up stitches for the 3 needle bind-off to join this around that, like that. And but in order for us to be able to do the same around the neck, we'll be picking up the stitches along the neckline with the help of a contrasting waste yarn, which we'll use to trap and mark the strands that we'll be picking up later. So here's my working yarn, and here's a piece of leftover yarn that's in a different color, and we'll start picking up the stitches some width away. So it's specified in the pattern how many stitches to skip here. It should be the same number of stitches that you cast on for the for each front here that overlaps and makes the button band area, so to speak. But the reason we leave that unpicked, if I can say that, is because we want the finishing edge here to be nice and rounded. We don't want there to be any ugly joins, so we'll work this as part of the entirety, as part of the entire length when we do the front opening finish, and then we'll join them here in the corner where it will be less visible, and it will also be easier to join when they meet at the same level and not perpendicular to each other. So that's the reason for beginning here in the corner. And the pattern says to pick up one along the edge here, along the vertical pickup. We need to pick up 1 stitch for every 2 rows, and that will just coincide with these purl bumps. Quite an easy way to see. It also says to pick up between the first and the second stitch, so we were knitting in this direction, so we can easily see that the second stitch column is this one. And if you can follow, this is the second stitch column, if you follow that leg and where it comes out, it will be the purl bump that when we come from the bottom to top will be facing upwards, the opposite of the actual stitches, because we were knitting top down. So I just need to find the first one of these upwards facing purl bumps here that I can pick up, and it should coincide with this line here. And yeah, I will use the working yarn to knit into that picked up thing. And then behind the work, I'll twist the working yarn with the waste yarn. If you've done stranded color work, that's how you would trap a long float. And pick up the next purl bump, and then in the next time I'll twist it in the opposite direction so my yarns don't get tangled. And pick up the next purl bump. Again, I will pick it up from under, and the next time from over. If you pick up twice, if you twist in the same direction twice, nothing bad's gonna happen. You'll still will have done the job. It will just make your yarns a little bit more tangled, but that's not a big deal. You can see if you're doing it right. If behind the work you can see, well, it's hard to see because they're not that contrasting for me in this case, but there are these little strands in the working yarn that are running across this waste yarn here, and we'll be using that to figure out where we need to pick up stitches when we go to join the edge with the 3 needle bind off. And we continue picking up 1 stitch for each row all the way along here to the top. And when we get to the back, which starts by these 3 knit stitches, we will pick up 1 stitch for each cast on stitch. So we'll be putting the needle through the actual stitch, not the legs, not the cast on legs of, not the legs of the loop below the stitches, but actually through the stitch. Obviously, if you make a big hole, then you have to fix that right away because it won't disappear, and you can make an exception there and pick another strand to put your needle through. But generally speaking, to pick up exactly the number of stitches that is needed, it's best to go through, find the shape of the stitch and go through it there, and finish with exactly the same approach that we took for the right front, also here for the left front. You'll have to find the second stitch column. It will be coinciding with the direction of knitting, and then you'll stop in this corner here, leaving this width unpicked for when we do the front opening finish. When we're ready to fold over the finishing edge and attach it to the base, we'll first need to pick up the stitches the strands that we trapped during the pickup row. And you can see that they're slanting in different directions because we change the twist direction every time. So when we pick this up here, we should try and pick it up so that it's mounted like a knit stitch would be, like any stitch, with the first leg at the front and the second leg, when looked at from right to left, at the back. So some of them will be easy to pick up like that. Some of them will have to go the opposite from the opposite when compared to the contrasting yarn. If you, oh, this one's a bit splitty, so I went through the contrast yarn, but there we go. So some will be really straightforward, and some will be a little bit trickier to pick up. But the reason we want them to all be mounted incorrectly, because when we do the 3 needle bind off, it won't be so easy to slide the stitch off to change its orientation. And if it's mounted incorrectly, if you knit through the front loop, it will appear twisted. I suppose it's not a huge deal because you essentially do not see that stitch, but it just for consistency, it's probably good to have all the stitches work the same way. And here as well, if you're struggling, I suppose we could use the other needle to pick it up and slide it on so that it's mounted correctly. I can pick it up like that, and then, oops, that one's incorrect now. What have I done? Yes, I want the first leg to be in front. That's how I want them. And you can either, I'm using a smaller needle. It's much easier to pick stitches up with a smaller size needle, and you can pick up along the entire length of the neckline, but you don't have to. You can start binding off, especially if you're using a DPN, for example, instead of a circular needle, you wouldn't have enough length. You can do it in sections. So as soon as you've picked up, let's say 10 stitches, you can start the bind off, and when you run out of stitches on the other needle, you can pick up the next 10, etc. That way you'll ensure that you pick up enough stitches for every single stitch on here. So because we're picking up the strands that are theoretically between stitches, in theory there will be one less strand trapped than there are stitches on the needle. But when we get to the end, we could fudge it by picking up another strand somewhere, just so we don't have an extra stitch. Or we can, when we get to the very end, we can knit the last 2 of the existing stitches together. So essentially we'll be knitting 3 stitches together. And here is how the bind-off would look. Where is my yarn? I must ensure I do the bind-off with the correct size needle, because that will impact the length of the bind-off. So I just knit through both of the stitches, 1 on each needle, and pass the first one over the second one once I've got 2. Again, knit through both of them, slide them off, and pass the first one over the second one. And if you're an English style knitter as well, the same. Insert both needle tips through 1 stitch on each needle, knit through both of them, slip them off, and pass the first one over. And we're getting rid of all the stitches and forming a little welt here at the as the finishing edge. In order to complete the front opening finish, we'll need to pick up stitches along the top of the front as well as the side here, and finish off with a few stitches here at the bottom of the front until we meet the hem edge. And we'll do the exact same picking up technique that we did for the neckline, namely that while we pick up 1 stitch for each stitch here at the cast on, we also trap the yarn with a contrasting waste yarn, so that afterwards we can know where to pick up the strands for the 3 needle bind off. So along here we'll pick up 1 stitch for every stitch that was cast on, and it specifies that number in the pattern. And here along the rows we'll pick up 1 stitch for every ridge. So we'll find that purl bump that sits between the edge stitch and the second column, and we'll just pick them up through there, just like we did for the neckline, all the way down, and then turn the work and again pick up 1 stitch for every stitch that was bound off here at the start of the hem. And we'll work the 6 rows of stockinette, or 5 rows of stockinette, and then either add the fringe loop stitch or simply knit them if you didn't like the loop stitch, and finally join those live stitches, binding them off with the picked up stitches as we did for the neckline. After we finish the front opening edge, we can see that there is a gap between the edge that we did on the hem at the bottom and the front opening. So it's time to close that up using one of the tails that you'll inevitably have, and we'll use a tapestry needle and mattress stitch. I'm just going to come out here, and I want to find that edge stitch of each of these edges, the edge stitch of the edge, and I will pick up 1 through the middle of the stitch on the first row, and join that to the middle of the first stitch on the other side, and pull together and move 1 row up And then the same here, all the way around. And it should appear a lot more neat and closed. Now we should be able to go all the way around, but it gets a little messy here if you did the fringe. If you didn't do the fringe, you should be it would be quite easy to see where you need to insert your tapestry needle, but I have done the fringe, and so things appear a little bit out of order, but it's okay because it is the inside and it doesn't really matter. We can't make it more messy than it already is, so we just kind of have to go in by feel and join these together. So I'll weave that end in a second. I just want to show you what that should look like. It's not, well, it's as smooth as we're gonna get, but it's better that we do it here than if we had to do the join here in the corner. We would get an interesting looking corner, not this smooth curve. And yeah, we can do that here. We also need to do that here at the top where the neckline joins the front, and obviously for the other side as well. So at any point after joining the front and the back, we are able to start and add the sleeve. And we do that by picking up the stitches around the armhole and working some short rows back and forth to shape the cap, along with a few decreases to get to the upper arp circumference, and then finally we just do the typical sleeve thing, working in the round. Picking up the sleeve stitches starts here at the center of the underarm, and for a little while we pick up along the cast on edge, we need to pick up one stitch for every stitch that was cast on. For a knit stitch, it's quite easy to see where to insert the needle, but when we get to the garter section of the body, it's a little bit trickier, but you can still, knowing that it was knit from the top down here, the stitches are in the opposite direction, so you can sort of spread it out and find that first row of stitches and insert your needle through the center of the stitch. Wrap your yarn around and do that for the specified number of stitches. For your size, it should be the same as what you cast on. And when we get to the end of the cast on, the pattern says to pick up one more stitch in the corner so that there isn't a huge hole forming. You can either insert the needle through the next stitch, but if that leaves a hole that is too big, you can pick up the strand that's next to it and sort of knit through the back loop, and that will conceal the hole. And this is where picking up along one stitch for each cast on stitch ends. Then that's why we need to place a marker, because we're going to be starting to pick up stitches vertically along the rows here, and it says to pick up between the first and second stitch columns, and those strands are kind of tricky to find, but if you worked it top down, you know the direction of the stitches is coming from the top, you can find that second column of stitches much easier. So here's one stitch, here's another, and when you follow the leg of the second column of stitches where it comes out, that is the strand that we will want to pick up. Obviously we need to start right next to where we pick up the last stitch, because we want to avoid a hole forming. And then when you get going, it gets much easier to find that strand. and we are picking up 1 stitch for every row. Even though the garter row gauge is almost double that of the stitch gauge, we will be doing an adjustment round in the next round where we decrease every second stitch. But picking up 1 stitch for every row means that this seam here is very, very neat and tidy. There's no bumps that happen when you skip rows, so which is why I prefer to pick up a lot more stitches than we need, to be honest, especially because it's garter stitch and the row gauge is so significantly different from the stitch gauge. But look at that, it's going to be very, very neat and tidy. So we'll do that all the way around the armhole, and when we get to the other corner, we'll place another marker and pick up another stitch in the corner, finishing off with just like we started. And when we're there, we can place a beginning of round marker, and I'll come back and talk about that adjustment round. Oh, I've picked up stitches all the way around the armhole, and there's a lot of them. So next one is a decrease round, but it's also the first time we are working in the round, and garter stitch in the round means that every second round will have to be purled, with the exception of the seam here at the underarm. That will follow the same pattern as the side seams for the body. So we'll be knitting all of the 2 surrounding beginning of round stitches on all rows. But because the decrease round coincides with the round that we need to purl, because we don't need to adjust the stitches or adjust the stitch gauge to match the stitch gauge, we can just purl all the way to the first marker that we placed to denote where we start to pick up stitches along the rows vertically. We can slip that marker when we get there, and the next set of stitches will be purling 2 together. For that we need, but because we need a stitch count that is an even number, we are going to skip the first one, and then all of the other stitches to 1 stitch before that other marker we'll be purling 2 together. If for any reason in the previous round you picked up more stitches than the pattern states, then you'd have to do more decreases, probably need to decrease also some of these stitches here near the corner. If you picked up less stitches than the pattern states, then you can skip some decreases. But it's important that after this decrease round, your stitch count does match that in the pattern, because we will be working the short rows and decreasing, and the cap shaping depends on that stitch count being correct. And once I've completed the decrease round, I'll come back and we'll talk about the first short row. And once we've done the decrease round and we have verified that the stitch count matches that in the pattern, we are to place a locking marker here to mark the top of the sleeve, the center. Note that it will not be the same place as the shoulder seam, because this is a European shoulder construction, so the shoulder is slightly backwards. So the center or the top of the sleeve cap, the middle of the sleeve cap, is actually part of the front, so to speak. But it should be equal distance of stitches away from the underarm, the beginning of round marker there. For our first short row, we are lucky that we are on the knit row of the garter stitch, so we get to knit all the way to this marker here, which we no longer need and can remove now. And then we need to knit all the way up to the locking marker that we just placed. Here we are at the top of the sleeve cap. So we'll slip this marker for now, and the first short row, the first time we turn, will be 8 stitches away from that center. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can use whichever short row method you prefer. I will demo this with the Japanese short row. And for Japanese short row, we need to trap the yarn at every turn. So and as this is a garter, I will slip the first stitch and knit backwards to create the purl ridge on the right side. When we get to the middle marker here, we can remove it because now we have already established. So we'll need to knit 8 more stitches. And we are the equal distance away from the center where we turn again. And that's our first short rows. Now we will move for a little while. We'll be moving 1 stitch with every row that we work. We'll be moving 1 stitch closer to the beginning of round. So at the same time, we'll also be concealing that gap that would otherwise appear if we didn't do it. And I'll show what that means when I get to the previous turn. Here I am at the previous turning point, and I need to move 1 more stitch before I turn and work back again. And this is where I use my Japanese short row trick of pulling that trap yarn, placing it on the needle, and knitting it together with the next stitch. That is also that stitch that we need to move 1 step further. And as soon as we've done this knit 2 together, we trap yarn and turn to work back again. And that is the section A in a nutshell. We knit all the way to the previous turn. And as we are now on the wrong side, we'll pick up, but instead of knitting it together, we want this stitch on the shorter side to lean over it. So we'll be doing an S, S, K. So slip knitwise, and knit both of them together through the back loop. That way we get that stitch lean over that loop. And again, just moving 1 stitch past the turn, turning to work backwards. And we'll be repeating this back and forth. I don't want to lose that. And we'll be repeating this back and forth for a specified number of times that's indicated in the pattern, and it will create the cap like so. And when we get to about, well, it depends on what size you're working, to about here for my size, we'll be looking at how we work section B of the sleeve cap. And once you've completed the section A, we can move on to section B, which is essentially the same type of back and forth short row that we've done till now, except here before we get to the turning point, we need to do a decrease as the armhole circumference is larger than the upper arm circumference. We need to lose some of these stitches somehow, and it's done along the remaining stitches to the underarm. So we'll knit to 3 stitches before the turn, and we'll knit 2 together on the right side. So that means we decrease a stitch. Then we'll knit that last stitch before the turn and carry on with our short row, concealing that gap. Knit 2 together and turn again, as we just need to move 1 stitch past the previous turn. The same on the wrong side, so we get to 3 stitches before the turn, and we will do a slip slip knit decrease to be symmetrical. So slip 1 knitwise, slip 1 knitwise, knit both of them through the back loop, knit that last stitch again, and repeat the same slip slip knit to conceal the short row gap here. So I'll make a turn and repeat these for a specified number of times until you reach the beginning of the underarm. So we shouldn't be working any short rows along the stitches that were picked up along the underarm cast on. So by the time you get to here, you should be done with the short rows. The pattern will tell you how many times to repeat those, and then once we've done with section B, we'll be returning to work in the round and down to the cuff. After finishing section B of the cap, we are in section C, in which we return to work in the round. And in the last short row, we closed the gap that we created by turning on the right side, and that was the same as we do usually, except we didn't turn, we just continued working to the beginning of round marker. And then on the next round, which coincides with a purl round, apart from the first stitch here, we are faced with the last turn that we need to close approaching from the other side than usually. So the actions we take will be slightly different here, in that we need to purl to 1 stitch before the turn, and we will be closing this gap by performing in theory a slip slip purl, because we need to produce a purl stitch. So I'm going to slip the first stitch knitwise, and then I will insert my needle into the loop and place them both on the left needle like so. This, by the way, this is just for people who do Japanese short rows. If you're using another short row method, you can disregard this instruction entirely. And I am supposed to do a purl through the back loop. That can be very tricky because that stitch is very tight, that loop is very tight. So if you're not able to do a purl through the back loop like I just did here, feel free to just purl them together, like purl 2 together. The impact will be minimal. And then we proceed with purling the rest of the round all the way around, and we are back to working in the round for any typical sleeve instruction. So adding the pocket is quite flexible. You could choose how big or small you want to add it. Of course, if you are a bigger size, you'll have more room to experiment. The sample has a 16 stitch wide and 16 row long base of the pocket detail. And it's situated so that this is what I wanted to achieve. I know I'll have a button here because I have a buttonhole there, and I wanted the button on the pocket to be in line with this button. So I followed along that ridge where my buttonhole is made to where I wanted the button for the pocket to be. and I went from there. So I did 8 stitches in either direction and 4 ridges higher. So those were my starting points. And after I had marked that on the side where I had the buttonhole, I could easily count down the ridges on the other side and mark the spots, because it's quite simple to count the ridges, and it's also quite simple to count the stitches. So once you've done the markings, but you might want to have your button bigger and sit higher or lower. You might just want it in one side or not at all. So it's totally up to you. And this is the demonstration of how I placed the button, the pocket for my size in my situation. And once you've done the choice for you, the steps will be the same for everybody. So we'll have to turn it upside down again, because we'll be working it top down. We'll be picking up stitches along this ridge here that we marked. So my head pins are marking the stitches where I'll start and finish picking up stitches for the pocket. And we use the same size needle that we did for the project, and we will just insert the needle into the purl bump of that marked ridge and knit that stitch, and then insert needle through the next purl bump. Note that there are actually 2 purl bumps on each ridge. One is kind of facing upwards, that is the face of the stitch, and then there's one that is facing downwards, the smiley face. We're not touching the smiley face ones, we are inserting into the frowny ones when looking at it upside down. So we move along this ridge, picking up and knitting into all of those frowny purl bumps until we get to the other end, to the other marker. And you will know whether your marker includes the stitch or sits just outside. I included it, so I should have 16 stitches on my needle, and that's important for me because that's how big the other pocket is, and I want to have them in the same size. And then we simply turn it around and knit all stitches going in the opposite direction. And I'll do that until I've got 8 ridges reached, so that will be 16 rows including the pickup row, and I'll bind off all stitches. The reason why I will bind off all stitches for the pocket and not work the fringy edge like we did for the hem and cuffs is because then it will be hard for us to get these round smooth edges. So it's better to bind things off and then do like we did for the neckline. We'll just pick up stitches along the edge here and then along the bind off and then the opposite side, all the while having a contrasting waste yarn, trapping the little floats at the back because we will again need them to pick up stitches, so we can do a 3 needle bind off here. But the base of the pocket is just simply picking up stitches and knitting it as long as you need to, and then binding it off. Once we're done with the pocket, the final thing to finish off is to attach this little edge to the fabric so that it doesn't flap around like that. And for that I've left a little tail here, which you'd have to weave in anyway. And at the same time as weaving in, we'll use a little mattress stitch to just pull this little side on and attach it to extend this line where we picked up stitches. So I will need the tapestry needle, and I both the tail through, and then I'll find that edge stitch here that I picked up here and worked, and I will pick up a strand or insert my tapestry needle through the middle of the stitch, and then in line with where I picked up the stitches, so that's just below this ridge, I will find the next strand in the fabric to attach it to, and I'll move up to the next stitch row and the next leg down here all the way to the top of that edge. Well, I mean, we don't need to touch the fringe because the fringe should be free, but we can attach that few rows that we did here before we did the loop stitch row. And I think that's about it. So that looks much better, and it's neatly in line with the picked up stitches here. All I've got to do is secure the end here somewhere and weave in the very end. I'll do in two directions in case there's some pulling. I can just cut that off, and we're ready to attach the button.